Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we are discussing thematic elements, and the topic of today is symbolism. Symbolism is a pervasive and important aspect of not only literature but also the way humans interact with each other, and literary symbolism is a very specific element that you do need to master, not only in this course but also you'll find useful in other courses as well. Symbolism simply is a term that refers to the author's use of a person, an item, an action, something within a story that has both literal meaning within the story and also symbolizes a concept as well. And as part of symbolic analysis, you have to be able to identify its literal meaning and its conceptual meaning, and they can't be the same thing. Essentially, there are different types of symbols. Objects are symbols, people, situations, actions, other elements like that. For symbols in a person, sometimes it might be hidden in a name. For example, in Tooth and Claw, Junior is trying to get away from being identified with his father, yet his name tells us that he is closely identified with his father because he's called Junior, which means son of his father. Likewise, in many stories, the author will actually give a character a name which has symbolic feeling or reference to the character's behavioral aspects or their general attitude. And you might also find that what the character does for a living, for example, or what their age or occupation, gender, race, infirmities are often indicated within not only their name but also with how they symbolize certain aspects of human nature. For example, in everyday use, the narrator, the mother, explains her children by often using animal references. And for her daughter Maggie, she makes a reference that her daughter is like a dog, a lame dog that has been run over by someone a careless person rich enough to own a car, and how she sidles along. Well, within that dog reference, she's saying many things about her daughter. First of all, she's explained that her daughter is indeed handicapped in particular ways. And she's also explaining how she's kind of cowed by the whole thing. But by using the term dog, we also realize that Maggie has a certain element of loyalty, that like dogs, she is really looking for approval and in some ways, some way to please her master, which would be anybody above her, which for Maggie would be most people. The author's use of using a dog as a reference then brings it around and adds more to the symbology of this character, and we realize that Maggie represents a person who has been created as, whose life has been created as a second-class experience because they make her a dog, and at the same time, other these other elements in terms of the literal description explain why many people see her as a second-class citizen of sorts. The mother herself makes reference to a cow. And how the cow is a fairly placid, large animal that gives milk until you milk it the wrong way, and then you can end up getting gored in the side. She's actually talking about herself. And like a cow, she's a large woman. She gives and gives and gives, mostly to her oldest daughter. And so in a lot of ways she's being milked by Dee. And at the same time, Dee steps over a line, and when she rejects her entire family and its heritage, and the mother gores her, basically gets her by taking the quilts away and by essentially taking away her right to that heritage that was offered to her before. In this case, the cow represents the mother because you explain, what a cow is: large, giving mother animal that is potentially dangerous if treated the wrong way. That's exactly the same description you'd have of the mother and the cow. That's the way symbolism works. If you're going to apply symbolism, you need to explain what the thing is. It's an oak tree, and then make a description. The oak tree is a strong, older, tall, regal tree, and then you attach it to a character. The character is older, they are mentally strong, they are morally strong, and they are in some ways respected in society, which raises them up. And people look up to them, the same way you look up to a large tree. And then the adjectives and the descriptors that describe the actual thing in the story also describe that symbology. When you're doing something where you say the character is more of a concept, in other words, the mother represents, Mrs. Johnson represents motherhood. Well, you wouldn't say she represents motherhood because she's a mother. There are many very non-motherhood-based mothers. Instead, you'd point out that motherhood is about giving, self-sacrifice, patience, and teaching. And then you'd explain how Mrs. Johnson is a person who is giving, she's self-sacrificing, she's patient, and she teaches. And the idea is you're linking the character and what they symbolize to a concept. And that concept is going to be some kind of conceptual noun you can't draw a picture of. You can give examples of, but you can't really draw a picture of, and that's when you know you actually have a concept. Symbols can also be involved with action. And the idea is that the action that happens in some ways is emblematic of something that means something else. For example, the Jackson stealing from Junior what little money he has, in some ways, is one of the many examples that Jackson gives, and what Alexie, the author, gives, of how Native Americans actually prey on each other. And certainly the argument between Dee and her mother and her sister in everyday use is Alice Walker's discussion of arguments that go on within African American culture that have nothing to do with any outside influence whatsoever. These actions symbolize these larger issues, and you need to identify these larger issues, identify the action going on, and show how they are connected. Sometimes you get spoken word. For example, it applies to a character speaking, can be symbolic of the entire story's theme. And you're looking for inflection, tone, what is not said. And this is where a symbol gets linked with irony. For example, the character Dee, when she's talking about the quilts that Maggie is supposed to get, that she herself rejected a while ago, she says that Maggie would be backward enough to use them for everyday use. And the mother points out that Dee's idea is just to hang them on the wall. Well, there's irony and symbol there. Symbolically, we realize that through Dee's words and her actions, she is the backward one. She has things backwards. She's going to take something that's been made for practical use and turn it into a piece of wall art that will have no functional use whatsoever. And the author's argument is to take this and to mix it with a little bit of irony and show how this particular aspect of the character brings out some of Dee's own misconceptions and her lack of real understanding as to what things are and what things mean. When you combine that with the fact that she uses the African languages randomly and incorrectly, that she is only a surface Muslim in terms of her what she eats and what she doesn't eat, etc., we begin to see that symbolically what the author is doing is taking these actions and her words and her image and all these things together to point out that this character is actually kind of a phony, and she's always been that way, and they're using these other elements symbolically to reinforce that notion. How to do this? Essentially, what you need to do is you need to brainstorm. A symbol is not cause and effect. A symbol has to be something that carries within the story a literal meaning, the regalia, and it carries with it also a symbolic meaning, Jackson's Native American heritage. And then you explain how it works. Well, it was stolen by the white culture, like the heritage. It has hidden aspects of it that other people would not see, the yellow bead. It is of differing value to the different people. To Jackson, it has to do with more sentimental meaning, and to the pawnbroker, it means money. And definitely that's how heritage is seen differently by people both within and without of the heritage. And ultimately, what Alexie is doing is he's having this person give that heritage back to the Native American person in some ways the same way that over time mostly Anglo society at large has been allowing Native Americans to reestablish their heritage through language and ceremony and land rights and those kinds of things. These symbolic elements have to be explained in a way that shows that you're explaining symbolism rather than something else. There are many analyses of symbolism. EBSCOhost and the Literature Resource Center will talk about symbolism in objects, in characters, in actions, in the like. And ultimately, the more you play with this, the more you'll recognize, wow, there's symbolism all over the place. You know, in The Simpsons, Bart symbolizes the id, the impulsive person. Maggie is the one who doesn't speak at all, and therefore in some ways she symbolizes a certain aspect of human behavior where she's simply an observer, but she has no voice in society. And you have Homer, who symbolizes the kind of moronic, also impulse-driven, but less articulate and certainly less aware than Bart. These elements, you say, well, that's just a cartoon, man. The authors are using symbolism all the time, and you see this used in print advertising, and you see this used in the most mundane television shows because it works and because it resonates with the author. If you're watching commercials, you are basically being drenched with symbolism that's supposed to get you to feel a particular way. And a Chanel No. 5 commercial that is aimed at an upper class, certainly well-off, middle-aged woman, as opposed to a Candy's commercial, which is aimed at a much younger demographic. When you look at the imagery in that commercial, you begin to realize, wow, the symbolism here has to do with level of income, level of sophistication, level of the portrayals of sexuality, level of all kinds of things. And really, it's what they're showing and what it's supposed to mean, and that's how symbolism works on a regular basis. Keep working with it, do some research, and we'll always talk about it in chat and in the classroom. Stay in touch.